The way our YouTube sensation, attorney Rebecca Hobbs, and I say that because she did this presentation here 3 years ago, and we recorded it, and it among our videos on YouTube has the most hits, most views. So she's got that. It went viral. Yep. So we're glad to have her back, Rebecca. Thank you.
Well, good evening and happy Veterans Day. Thank you all for being here. I am going to talk tonight about veterans benefits. We're going to talk about pension benefits primarily, and then I'll talk a little bit about disability compensation as well. I have some material here which you can grab at the end. I have our firm brochure, my business card, and then a summary of what the current pension benefit rates are for the VA for 2018. That will change January of 2019, so those numbers will all be adjusted for inflation in January. So first, just a little bit about me and the firm that I work with. So my name is Rebecca Hobbs, and I am an associate attorney with Weiss and Mattei. We have an office right downtown in Phoenixville in the Borough Hall building, and then we also have an office in Pottstown. So I practice elder law, special needs planning, veterans benefits, but we have attorneys that practice in a bunch of different practice areas. So we have attorneys that do family law, business planning, real estate. We're a full service law firm. So the brochure, if you pick one up at the end, that has a list of all the different practice areas. There's 13 attorneys there, so you can see all the different areas that we practice in. So for the purposes of tonight, like I said, we're going to focus specifically on veterans benefits. Since we have a small group, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, ask away, and hopefully I'll get to all your questions as we go along. So I know this PowerPoint's really tiny because the screen's tiny, so I'll talk loud, and I can always email you the material as well. So like I said, we're going to talk about veterans benefits, specifically talking about the pension. Just this past month in October, there was a big change to the VA pension rules. So we're going to talk about the changes and now the rules regarding assets and income that were implemented as of October 18th. Like I said, we'll talk a little bit about disability compensation. Really, my practice area is in the pension field. I don't do much with the disability compensation, but I can explain a little bit about the differences between disability and pension. And then we'll talk a little bit about survivor rights as well and how that plays into these two camps of benefits. All right, so veterans pension, a lot of people refer to it as aid and attendance. And that's one of the levels of the pension benefit under that pension benefit title. So we'll talk about that and all the different types of pension benefits under there. So to qualify for veterans pension benefits, there are different criteria that you have to meet for your service, as well as an income and asset requirement. There have been no changes to the requirements for times of service, dates of service, all of those eligibility requirements are still the same. They've been the same for a while. So I'm going to talk about those briefly and then focus in on the new rules with income and assets, because that's where a lot of people have questions since that material is so new. So one of the requirements is that you have to have served during a period of wartime. And it's wartime established by Congress. And I have the dates of service that they look to as periods of wartime on the slide coming up. You must be permanently and totally disabled, but your disability does not need to relate to your service. So that's the big difference between disability compensation and pension benefits, is that the disability, there's no relation between your time of service and your disability. The VA pension is a needs-based program. So those that are entitled to the program must meet the eligibility requirements with income and assets, which is another big difference between the pension and disability compensation, because disability compensation is an entitlement benefit, which means there are no limits to income or assets to receive that benefit, but there are for the pension benefit. The main benefit of the veterans pension is, for my clients, it helps when they start to age and their medical expenses begin to increase. when the cost of care for them begins to rise, the pension benefit can help defray those costs by providing a monthly income to them. So that's really where I see for my clients the benefit of the pension benefit. So there are, underneath the veteran's pension, there are 3 classifications for the pension. So the first is just the basic pension. The second is housebound benefit. And the third is aid and attendance, which is the most common applicant that I see, is the aid and attendance. And that is where an individual requires assistance with their activities of daily living. So to qualify for this, if the veteran is in a nursing home, they're going to automatically qualify. Or if they're in an assisted living facility and they need assistance with at least 2 of the 5 activities of daily living, then they would qualify for this benefit. Another presumption, if the veteran is blind, they also automatically meet that criteria for the aid and attendance. The basic pension, very rarely do I see clients qualify for that. That basic pension would be for somebody that's very low income and low asset that may qualify for that pension benefit. So the other eligibility requirements, so with the time of service, so we talked about how it has to be during a period of wartime. You also have to have at least 90 consecutive days of service, with at least one of those days being during a period of wartime. So when you look at your total days of service, only 1 day of service has to fall within that period of time as designated by Congress. Your discharge must have been other than dishonorable. And we talked about the disability requirement.
Go back to that.
Sure.
If you're over 65,
Yeah, so if you're over 65, you're presumed to be totally disabled. So you're going to meet that first benefit classification, which is the basic pension, if you're over the age of 65. Then it's just a matter of if you want to get to those next levels, meeting those criteria. So for the basic pension, you would have to meet their income standard to be able to qualify for that pension. So there's no requirement that you serve during or in a combat zone. So there's no requirement for that. The requirement really is just the 90 consecutive days, and at least one of those days being during the period of wartime. These are the designations. The VA website has all of the periods of wartime on their website, so you can look at your dates of service to see if it falls within one of these periods. Okay, so that's just the basic eligibility requirement for service and discharge and disability. What I want to spend the most time on is the income and asset requirements, because that can get a little bit complicated. And that can be confusing for many veterans that want to apply for the pension benefit. So what's important to note is there weren't many changes to the income qualification factors, and we'll talk about that with the October 18th new rules. They still look at all countable income of the veteran, and they look to make sure that your countable income less your unreimbursed medical expenses. So what the VA does is they look at your income and then allow you to deduct certain things from your income, which are called unreimbursed medical expenses. And that income has to not exceed the pension rate in order to qualify for the income portion of the veteran's pension. So examples of unreimbursed medical expenses, prescription costs, co-pays, premiums for insurance. It would also include the cost of long-term care. That's where you're going to see that the veteran then is qualifying for the pension because their income is being depleted by the cost of their care. So that could include at-home care, so paying for a health care worker to come to the home. That would include assisted living facilities and, of course, nursing home costs as well.
Excuse me, does that include the spouse's income?
The income qualification does not look at the spouse's income, unless the spouse is the one that's applying for the pension. So where you have a veteran that's deceased and the surviving spouse is applying, in that situation, their income would be counted. But in the situation where you're dealing with a husband and wife, and one of them is the pension, the other one is still living, then they would just look at the veteran's income. Now for assets, they're gonna look at both, the husband and the wife's assets. But for income, they're only looking at the veteran. So this is the list that I rattled off with what they're looking at for the medical expenses, so the nursing home costs, assisted living, premium, supplemental insurance.
If you're drawing down from your savings for living expenses, not IRAs, and so it's not taxable or anything, is that considered income? You're just withdrawing assets?
No, that would just be your
That's
asset,
an
your
asset.
principal
And
asset.
that's at a certain date, I guess, or whatever.
Yeah, so your income is going to be
Social
your
Security,
pension, your social security, interest and
The
dividends.
interest on it, they probably count.
Yeah, yeah, so that's gonna be your income. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about the big changes to the rules. One of the small clarifications that actually I think really helps veterans is they clarified what could be deducted when it comes to nursing home costs and assisted living costs. Before there was some question about whether room and board could be deducted when it was like an assisted living or something to that nature, or even independent living. So where the doctor certifies that the individual requires that level of care and they need the custodial care that is being provided, then room and board can be deducted. The rules provide a little bit more clarity when it comes to deducting those expenses. So that's good. Not a real change, just more clarity to what they meant by that. The big change that people aren't very happy about is that the VA instituted a look-back period. So this was something that when they came out with the proposed rules a couple years ago, they got a lot of backlash for because people did not like the idea of now the VA creating this look-back period. It passed, they have passed it, so it does have a look-back period similar to Medicaid, the time frame a little bit shorter. So they do have a 36-month look-back period. So what does that mean? So just like with Medicaid benefits, the VA is going to look back those 36 months to make sure the veteran has not gifted assets that would disqualify them from pension benefits. So prior to October 18th, 2018, in order to qualify for veterans benefits, the veteran would be able to move money to a trust or move money to children or gift assets in order to immediately qualify for veterans benefits to get below their asset requirement. Now they can no longer do that because of this rule. Anything that was transferred prior to the enactment of the new rules, so any transfers made prior to October 18th, they're not going to penalize the veteran for. So it's starting October 18th. Transfers going back then will create a penalty period for the veteran, and we'll talk about how they're going to calculate that. So that was a big change that people aren't very happy about. So there are exceptions to the transfer penalty rules. So where a veteran is making transfers to a child who has a disability, there is an exception, just like in Medicaid. There's also no transfer penalty if the gift that was made was, the individual was already below the asset limit. So for example, the new asset limit we're going to talk about, but it's $123,600 in assets. And we'll talk about how they come up with that number and what goes into that figure. But if the veteran was below that asset limit and gifted assets, that won't cause a penalty. It's only if they gift excess assets that will create a penalty. It's a little bit different than Medicaid with regard to that. They also limit the penalty period, that the penalty period won't be greater than 5 years. So they do cap it as to how long that penalty period will last. And they base the penalty period and the calculation on the highest level of pension, the aid and attendance. So that's your penalty divisor, which is more favorable to the veteran than the proposed rules, because the proposed rules, wanted to use that lower pension amount in some instances, which would create an even longer penalty period. So here, in all instances of the transfer penalty, they're going to look at that higher pension rate for the penalty divisor, figure out how many months the veteran's not eligible for the pension because of the gifted assets. Another big change was that the VA is now going to penalize the purchase of annuities. So a lot of individuals that did veterans planning for veterans would create a plan whereby the veteran would purchase an annuity, and the annuity payments would be considered income, and they wouldn't look at the actual principal of the annuity as an asset. It was a planning tool that was used. The VA doesn't like that planning tool, so they've decided to do away with that. And if you purchase an annuity within that 5-year look-back period, it will create a penalty for you. All right, so the calculation of the penalty rate, I think I went over this briefly, but the whole idea is they're going to look at the total amount that was gifted and divide it by that penalty divisor, which is the maximum pension. So for 2018, it's $2,169 per month. So if you gifted $50,000 of assets, they would take $50,000, divide it by that number to figure out how many months you're not eligible for the pension because of that gift. Not to exceed 5 years, though. Okay, so the new net worth requirements. So this, I think, is good for veterans because before, the VA rules with pension eligibility requirements did not have a hard set rule. So there were these unspoken rules as far as how many assets an individual could have and still be eligible for the pension benefits. So now we know what the VA is looking at, and we know what we're working with. So the amount is currently set at $123,600 for total countable assets in order to be eligible for VA pension benefits. So what do they look at when they're calculating this number? So the first excluded asset for an individual is their primary residence. The VA refers to it as the homestead. They do not count that. The one little nuance to this rule is the VA only has carved out the home and 2 acres. So if you have a farm or a property with a lot of acres, then you could have an ineligibility issue. They would count the value of that land against you. So the only thing that is excluded is the house and 2 acres. The other thing that they have excluded would be assets that are personal property. So they don't look at your vehicle, they don't look at your personal property. They don't count those assets. So the home and personal property are the big exclusions for what the VA is looking at when they're counting the total amount of assets that you have to determine if you're eligible for the pension benefit. The other thing that's different than what the VA did prior, another change to the rules, is they add your annual income to your assets. So what they do is they look at your net income after your unreimbursed medical expenses, and that amount is added to your assets that they're counting, so your bank accounts, investment accounts, IRAs are countable. They're going to look at all of that, add your income to figure out if you're below this 123 number. And this, I think I mentioned this, that the veteran's assets and the spouse's assets are counted. So they do look at both. And another difference between Medicaid and the VA when you're talking about how they consider assets is in Medicaid, the spouse's IRA is not counted. For VA purposes, the spouse's IRA is counted to figure out the total amount.
How do they treat, I know Medicaid, if it's in 2 names, they count it all as
Yeah.
the person. How does veterans look at it if it's not a spouse's name, but two names?
Yeah, they're gonna look at it, so historically what they did is they considered it based on, so if you had it titled with a child, they would only consider one half of it available. The rules don't really speak to that, so the assumption is that it's gonna be the same. The one difference is what we used to do to qualify for a veteran last minute for benefits was to maybe add a child to the account to limit that total value. Now when you add the child, you're gonna create a penalty issue because it's gonna be a transfer.
Well, what if it was added before this October?
Yeah, if it was
on there
added before, then you may be safe. But until you file the application and we start seeing how the VA is gonna treat this, there's really no new guidance on that. So the way Medicaid treats it is they look to see
And
how much you
count it all.
contributed to
Count
the
it all
account.
or something.
So if the child's not contributing to the account, then it's considered to be the parent.
Well, in this case, your children are adults, so it's hard to say.
Right, yeah, so the burden of proof is on the applicant, so you have to be able to trace the funds to show that they were
Yeah.
contributing.
One more, question on income. What if you have like a fluctuating income? Like you suddenly have a spike one year because you cash something.
Right,
Do they look at more than 1 year's income or just?
yeah, so what they're gonna look at is reoccurring income.
Okay.
So if you can explain to them what
Why
that
that
spike
1 year?
was, and that wasn't reoccurring income.
And
that-
chances are that would have been moved into asset then anyway.
Right,
but-
right, yeah, so if you took a higher, like required, if you took more from your IRA that year and that spiked your
Like in this case,
income.
like a cashing bond, so you get a
Right.
1 year spike, but it's going into assets.
Yeah, so the VA is going to look at the reoccurring income.
Okay.
So if you can
Okay.
show to them that that was just that one-time occurrence, and that won't create an issue.
One more question, I'm sorry.
Sure.
The assistance for when you're like in independent living or in a nursing home, what, are you entitled, assuming you meet all the requirements, if you're in your own home, have people coming in?
Yep, so it'd be the same thing. So if you're at home and you have people coming in, then the cost of that care will be deducted.
As long as the doctor, I guess, had to.
Well, so in that situation, there'd be a form, just like in the others, where you would have your doctor fill out saying that you require that level of care. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about that. What is excluded? We talked about the house, the 2 acres, personal property. Okay, so this is just an example. So assuming a veteran has assets of $117,000 and then annual income of $9,000, which I know is a low amount, but just for the sake of this example, you would add those two amounts together to get 126, and then they're not going to be eligible for benefits because they're under that 123 number. So they would have to spend down assets in order to qualify for the pension. All right, so these are the pension rates for 2018, and I have them here too. You can grab them when we're done. That lists out all the numbers. So you'll see that the highest amount that you can get is the aid and attendance. So that benefit there is $21,962 a year with no dependents, or with a dependent, which would be a spouse. You're going to get the maximum amount, which is the $26,036. So that's the maximum pension for 2018. And then again, that number will go up in January. So it's set for inflation. These are the rates if the veteran is the one applying for benefits. The rates are a little bit lower where the spouse of the veteran is applying. So where the veteran is deceased and the spouse is applying for benefits, the rates go down. And you'll see that the highest amount would be the $16,837.
Which one is this surviving spouse on there?
So all of these rates are for the surviving spouse.
Oh.
So the different, so the different criteria are the basic pension with a dependent or with one dependent. So without a dependent, with one dependent, the housebound rate. Remember in the beginning we talked about the different levels of pension benefits. There was the basic pension, the housebound, and then aid and attendance. So it's separating those out, and then the highest one being here, aid and attendance. But these are all for where the surviving spouse is applying with a deceased veteran. The ones before was where the veteran is applying. was the pension. Any more questions about the pension, how that works? I do want to just mention the application process. I know a lot of people get bogged down with the idea of applying for the pension because there's a lot of documents you have to submit. And on average, it can take anywhere from 6 months to a year for your application to be approved. That unfortunately hasn't changed, but it's still taking a long time. The good news is that the VA does pay benefits retroactively. So if you apply today and when your application is received, on the face of the application you qualify, so you're not over-resourced. If you don't get approved for a year, the VA will go back and retroactively pay from the date that you applied. So they do honor that, but it does take a while for those payments to begin coming in. The best thing to do is to make sure that when you file, you do qualify for benefits, which means you're not over-resourced, and that you provide them with all the documents that they're going to need in order to make their determination. Because they love to send it back saying you haven't provided them with the information that they need. And all of the applications are right, and all the forms that you would need are right on the VA's website. Okay, so that is pension. And then we're going to talk about disability compensation a little bit. So when we think about disability compensation, like I talked about in the beginning, this is an entitlement benefit. So there's going to be no rules when it comes to limits for income and assets. The whole idea of this benefit, one, it's tax-free. And the idea is that you were injured during your time of service. And because of that, now the VA is going to pay you a disability compensation. The one thing to note is that the disability doesn't have to be related to your service as far as you weren't injured in combat or in, I mean, that would qualify as well, but it just has to be during your time of service. The VA does work a little bit different than when you think about like Social Security, disability, workers' comp. The VA works on a rating system. So it starts at increments of 10% and goes to 100. If you're rated 100% disabled, then you're going to be getting the maximum compensation. But it starts at 10%. In the VA rating system, you actually have to be rated by the VA in order to begin the compensation process. And it is just like the pension, it's a monthly check that you're going to get from the VA, which correlates with, again, your rating as far as how disabled the VA has rated you. So the requirements are a service-related injury, and you have to be at least rated at least 10% disabled. You do have to establish an evidence between the disability, injury, disease, and the event in your military service. You have to show medical records to establish the time of the injury and show that that was during your time of service. There's no means test, so no asset thresholds, no income thresholds. The VA, I actually think, has better information on the disability compensation on their website than the pension benefits. So if you're looking for information on disability compensation, the VA's website is actually really helpful, and they have some good information there on that. I did want to mention, only because this is a question I get commonly, calls to the office, is on whether PTSD would qualify for disability compensation. And in 2010, they did make new regulations specifically regarding PTSD, where it now can be seen as a disability that the VA will compensate for. The big disconnect that I see with a lot of the veterans that are calling is getting the diagnosis of PTSD. That's oftentimes the hardest thing. And then once you have the diagnosis, then you're able to get the disability compensation, but reaching that diagnosis can be difficult. What I like to tell veterans is that although you can go to the VA to receive medical treatment and receive a diagnosis, benefits. There's no requirement that you absolutely go there. You can go to a private healthcare provider to get the diagnosis, and the VA is supposed to accept that diagnosis from a private healthcare provider. There are some resources here for veterans with PTSD that are looking for information on disability compensation, specifically with the diagnosis of PTSD. So the Wounded Warriors Project has some good information, and then the information for the Coatesville VA Medical Center is there also. Okay, any questions about disability compensation? How that works? So we talked about pension benefits, which is the benefit that you have to qualify because of disability, because you need assistance with health, and you have the income and asset requirements. So that's one camp of benefits under the VA. Then we talked about a little bit about disability compensation, which there's no income or asset requirements, but there is the requirement that you be disabled or injured during your time of service, and then rated disabled. So we're going to talk a little bit about survivors' rights to compensation or pension. So just kind of a quick overview. A surviving spouse or a dependent child, there's different types of benefits for them as well. So there are benefits available where the veteran dies because of their service. So that's a different type of compensation. That is called dependency and indemnity compensation. So it's abbreviated DIC. The VA website has a lot of good information on that as well. Most commonly the questions I get, because I'm dealing with the pension benefits, is the survivor of the veteran trying to apply for aid and attendance. So in the beginning we talked a long time about those qualifications. And for a survivor of a veteran, the spouse, to apply for pension benefits, it's going to be the same requirements. So they're going to look to make sure the veteran qualified based on their time of service. They're going to make sure that the spouse meets the income and asset requirements. And then they're going to look to whether the spouse is over the age of 65 and what kind of assistance that she requires or he requires in order to receive that survivorship pension. So very similar requirements. The main difference just being the level of pension that you're eligible for, so the amount that you would receive per month. The other requirement is that the veteran is deceased. So the survivor can apply for benefits if the veteran is still alive. So it's only where the veteran is deceased that you can apply, that the spouse can apply for these benefits. And it's the same level of benefits with the housebound, with the basic pension, the housebound, and then the aid and attendance pension. So I know I went through all of that information. I wanted to leave a good chunk of time to talk about questions or things that you guys wanted to talk about. If you don't have questions, I can talk some more about VA benefits, but I wanted to see if there were any questions or anything that you wanted more information on. Sure.
I have insurance, but suppose if I had to go to the hospital or something, the VA hospital, would that be in Philadelphia or they would in Boston?
You can,
Not
the
by-
Coastville? Yeah. So the big thing with the VA is you need to make sure that you're in their system for insurance. So if you've been treated there before, if you're not, then it would be good to go and make sure that you're in their system, they have your records, and they have you registered as being able to be treated there. But then, yes, you could go there for treatment. You had a question?
Years ago, I tried to get benefits for my mom after my dad had passed away, and I ran into a lot of trouble. It was really hard for me to get information online and talking to people on the phone. I never really contacted an attorney, but I should have, because I was told that the house counted, her house counted as an asset. would automatically disqualify her. And at that time, I think the asset limit was like 80,000, maybe 5 or more years ago.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, so up until October 18th of this year, 80,000 was kind of the unspoken rule. So there was nothing in writing that said the limit was 80,000. But it was known that if you submitted an application and you had more than 80,000, chances are you were going to get denied benefits. So that's where this rule is beneficial, because we have now a bright line rule of what you need to be at to qualify. If you're looking for assistance for veterans benefits, I do work with veterans applying for benefits. They're also on the VA website. You can go to their website and they have a whole database of attorneys that are accredited with the VA. So in order for an attorney to present an application for any of these benefits that we talked about today, you do have to be accredited with the VA. If you're not accredited with the VA, then VA will not allow you to practice in this area of law. So if you go to the VA's website, you can put in your zip code and it will give you a list of attorneys that are accredited near you that could help you with your claim.
Are you accredited?
I am.
So you could help assist with the
I
application?
could, yes.
What if the person lives in New York? Since this is federal,
Yeah.
does it matter?
It does, only because even though the VA rules are federal, a lot of times there's going to be local rules that play into it when we're thinking of the total plan. So when I'm working with a veteran to qualify them for pension benefits, I'm also thinking about Medicaid, because I don't want to do something that's going to disqualify them from Medicaid benefits.
And that's more state.
And Medicaid is very state specific. So although Medicaid has federal law also, each state has their own Medicaid plan and interprets those rules differently. Yeah, so it's good to, I mean, if you go to the website, you're going to be able to find attorneys that are in New York that are accredited as well.
What is available to the surviving spouse again? Death pension and aid in attendance?
Yeah, so you still have all of those. They just call it something different. So they call it the survivor death pension, but it still has all those levels. So you have the basic pension, housebound, and aid in attendance. And in this handout, it has all of those listed as well.
What's the difference with the housebound and what's considered housebound versus?
Yeah,
the other?
so the housebound, the qualifications, in my opinion, if you're meeting those, and you're almost at the point of meeting aid in attendance, so why not try to bump it up to that? But the housebound is basically that the veteran is unable to leave the home without assistance. So it's demonstrating that. Good.
So that becomes one of the two things possibly or whatever.
Yeah, so when they're looking at the activities of daily living, I have never had a veteran that met those requirements that I wasn't able to meet the aid and attendance requirement. I can't think of a good example of what that would. I mean, I guess if you just needed assistance at home, but maybe you were still able to, you know, get around on your own, just not able to drive.
There could be
or,
certain things.
yeah, there could be certain things that you would meet that criteria. But it really all depends on the information the doctor puts on their doctor's certification as far as what assistance you need on a daily basis. But yeah, so this sheet that I handed out, that has all the 2018 numbers. It also has a link if you want to type in the VA's website to look at the wartime periods. That's on the sheet as well. But on the front, it has the pension benefits for the veteran, and then on the back, it has surviving spouse death pension limits. And you'll see it's broken out just like the veterans, where it has the death pension with one dependent child or no dependent, housebound, aid and attendance. And then if you have more than one dependent, then you add on a certain amount.
So if you were filling out an application now, or let's say January, and then the new year, and the assets were in two names prior to all this, prior to the year and all that, how would you list those?
You mean they're with a child? The
No, not a
assets?
child, an adult. Adult child.
An adult child, yeah. So I would look at the total, I mean, I don't know how much extra we're talking about.
I mean, it would probably still all be under the limit.
Yeah, if it's still all under the limit, I wouldn't be worried
Or
about it. Yeah, so it's, I mean, I look at each case on a case-by-case basis to figure out what might be the best option for that.
I mean, you're gonna, I guess you have to send them a list of all the accounts
Yes,
and the names on
yeah,
them.
yeah.
And one, they might question,
But if the amount is under, if your total amount is under that
Right.
limit, then they're not
They're
gonna be
not gonna-
looking at it as, as carefully.
Did you say the value of the house is included in the asset limit?
No, it's not. So they exclude, they call it a homestead exclusion. So they exclude the house and up to 2 acres of land. They do not include that, which is similar to Medicaid. 'Cause
But
Medicaid
it's
doesn't
all
have-
savings plus a year of income, like there's no cap on the income or?
Yep, so they're gonna look at your total gross assets, and then they're gonna look at your annual income. And then your annual income is deducted based on your unreimbursed medical expenses. So that's where, if you're paying for long-term care, assisted living, or at-home care, then that's gonna deplete your income to almost zero. So then we're just looking at assets. So that's where the veteran is most likely going to qualify for that aid and attendance, is where their income is being depleted by the cost of care. And they're now dipping into their principal assets in order to be able to cover that. Then that's where that aid and attendance is really going to be beneficial. Yes.
When they consider your unreimbursed medical expenses, do they only look at bills that are generated from doctors who are Medicare providers? Or do they consider unreimbursed medical expenses from other sources, like if you were going for some types of alternative therapies or chiropractic or something that really is not covered by Medicare, you're paying out of pocket? Do they consider all that too?
Yeah, they would consider all of that also. They're gonna look at reoccurring medical expenses though. So you would have to demonstrate that that's something that's a reoccurring expense. Yeah. Again, usually where the veteran's gonna have enough medical expenses to really deplete the income to where you're qualifying for benefits is where you're paying for long-term care. So you're paying for somebody to come into the home, or you're paying for assisted living, unless you have a veteran that has a very low income.
how do they, I know this came up once before with my mom, about moving into a place that's designated technically independent living apartment, but the place provides the meals and all the other utilities, everything else, that a certain portion of that would be considered
Yeah, so it's not
assistance, I guess?
right. It's not as cut and dry as like
Yeah.
assisted living or nursing home care.
Right.
So that's where you're going to have to demonstrate that that it is medical care, and you can do that through like a doctor's certification.
Or
and
some of those 5
facility.
things or
But if-
whatever,
if it-
providing meals, is providing.
Yeah, but if it truly is where the individual is independent and doesn't require assistance with activities of daily living, then they're not going to meet those requirements.
That's how you present it, I guess.
Yeah, so it's really when that individual requires assistance with their activities of daily living, which then assuming they're not going to be independent anymore, they're going to require
Yeah,
care.
just came up, if they're living there, but they have some extra help coming in.
Then that would be
That would be covered.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
would be- So it's not the facility, it's the aid also coming in.
right. Okay, are there any other questions about veterans benefits, veterans pension?
What's a veteran's pension? Would you retire 20 years?
So what you're
It's not
talking
a pension,
about,
yeah.
is retirement. So when we talked about pension for this purposes, it was the aid and attendance pension, which is different than the retirement benefits. So the retirement benefits is where you've served and you've retired in the military, which is a whole different classification. Yeah, we didn't cover that here today. So yeah, just today we're talking about the disability compensation, and then the pension benefits, which is based on low income and asset. Disability. Okay?
Okay,
Well, thank you very much for coming.